refused to comply. That's exactly what the people did to bring down and eventually nullify the hated Stamp Act, which went into effect on November 1st, 1765. Of course, we've all heard about the fiery protests, the tarring and feathering, but there is much more to the story, especially strategically. And on this episode, I'm going to highlight their hidden strategies of defiance, the methods that they used that the government-run schools today really never teach us about. And these are the same strategies that the founders years later told us to use to stop usurpations of power, violations of the Constitution today. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for November 1st, 2024. And here a quick background piece from History.com. They point out that it was passed without debate by Parliament in March of 1765. The Stamp Act was designed to force colonists to use special stamped paper in the printing of newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, and playing cards, and to have a stamp embossed on all commercial and legal papers. Basically, any type of business that required any type of paperwork required a stamp. And I've got an image here up on the screen that has kind of a proof copy of a set of these stamps. And it's interesting that the stamp itself had an image of a Tudor rose, and it was framed by the word America and a French phrase that I don't know how to pronounce, but it basically translates to shame to him who thinks evil of it. Well, it was pretty common that they all thought it was evil. There were, of course, some outliers, but in early May of 1765, when passage of the act finally hit the colonies, the Virginia House of Burgesses reconvened. And on his 29th birthday, May 29th, 1765, Patrick Henry introduced a series of resolutions against the Stamp Act. And in a speech the following day in support of them, we all hear this famous phrase attributed to Patrick Henry, "If this be treason, that's where it comes from." Now, a number of those resolutions passed, and even the ones that didn't were widely published all over and helped spark the resistance to the Stamp Act. I covered that in some detail in an episode a few years ago, Patrick Henry versus the Stamp Act. I do hope you will check that one out. Now, here are a few highlights from Patrick Henry's resolutions. First of all, the General Assembly of this colony, together with His Majesty or his substitutes, have, in their representative capacity, the only exclusive right and power to lay taxes and imposts upon the inhabitants of this colony, and that every attempt to vest such power in any other person or persons whatever than the General Assembly aforesaid is illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust, and have a manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American liberty. This is very, very great prose, of course, from Patrick Henry, who is known for that kind of thing, but he's kind of like the original 10th Amendment guy, kind of really supporting a line in the sand where they have certain powers, very limited, but the ones that affect the lives and liberties of the people most are only to be handled on a local level. Here for Patrick Henry, in the colonies in Virginia, he's talking about taxes and imposts, but this is about a line in the sand. And if they go beyond that line in the sand, it's unconstitutional, whether they think it's unconstitutional or not. So it's illegal. And how do you treat something that's illegal? Well, Patrick Henry told us. His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them, other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. Now, again, news of these resolutions, even the ones that didn't pass, quickly spread like wildfire. And they really inspired both the Loyal Nine, the precursor, and the Sons of Liberty in Boston and elsewhere. And there they burned effigies. We learned about this, burned in effigy the likely Stamp Act Commissioner Andrew Oliver on August 14th, 1765. And here in an interesting letter from Cyrus Baldwin, who was there, writing a letter to his brother on the 15th, the day after they burned Oliver in effigy, he wrote a letter to describe in detail what happened that day. And he pointed out this. He said, "'Tis hoped that Mr. Oliver has suffered will be sufficient warning to others not to take offices that encroach upon American liberty. The attitude was, if there's something that's going to be enforced that encroaches on our liberty, the people that they want to hire for that, well, they should be pushed back against. And people should not even take that kind of job. There's a lot of people, I guess they're rent seekers in some ways, people who are, I don't know if that's the right term, but people who are taking jobs, I just got to get by, who are willing to enforce stuff that violates our liberty, violates the Constitution. Now, even though Oliver was not even officially appointed at that point yet, he did a public resignation on August the 17th. Just a few days later, there was a huge pushback. Now, of course, Sons of Liberty, the resistance spread all over the place, New York, Connecticut, many other colonies all over the place. Here, for example, in massar.org, this will be linked to in the show notes along with everything else. By October 1765, protests in Maryland reached a point where even the Governor Horatio Sharp, was becoming concerned about the arrival of stamped paper. He believed that the populace was not going to allow it to be offloaded, and if it was, they would destroy it. So this strong resistance and opposition from the people even pushed the royal governor, to do something that, well, probably Parliament did not like. He requested that the stamped paper remained on board ship until the situation calmed down. The effective date of the Stamp Act, November 1st, 1765, arrived, and the necessary stamped paper to conduct almost all business in the colony was unavailable. So they basically shut down the offloading of the stamped paper, which everyone knew was coming, the stamps that were coming from Britain. Now, pretty much all the stamp tax distributors were intimidated into, well, not enforcing or officially resigning their commissions, and the tax all over the place was really never effectively collected. But that's not the whole story. Even the courts got involved. So in Maryland, this actually set the stage for the Frederick County Court, and this is from an article by Mike Meharry, to effectively nullify the Stamp Act by ignoring it and telling everybody to ignore it as well. Mike writes that 12 magistrates of the Frederick County Court presided over the legal affairs of the county. And in mid-November, the court ordered a local man to be released on bail and directed court clerk John Darnell to note the order in the court record. But under the Stamp Act, that required stamped paper, and this guy said, well, I'm not going to do any business. I'm going to follow the Stamp Act. And this brought all legal and commercial business in Frederick County to a halt. The court then ordered him to do stuff, and he refused. And so they found him in contempt on November 18th. And on November 23rd, Meharry writes, the court issued a formal, unanimous ruling that the Stamp Act was to be ignored, effectively nullifying it in practice and effect and the county. The court gave a couple of reasons, and it's kind of like they were sidestepping the issue. They're like, well, we've never really received a formal notice of this thing, even though everyone knew what was going on, and there was no stamped paper. So they're saying, well, too bad, this was effective, and the court sided with the people and said, let's nullify this thing. Now, here from chapter 31 of Murray Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, we've published a little excerpt of this. This is really amazing history. You'll find it all over at Mises.org, great website. He points out that among the colonies, there were 4 states. He said only 4, but there were 4 states, colonies. There were 4 of them: New Hampshire, Maryland, Delaware, and Rhode Island, which all opened their courts before repeal came through. So the courts were actually, the court system, the judges, the justices, the entire system was defying the act of Parliament. And Parliament, of course, was seen as supreme and sovereign. It could do no wrong according to the British system. Rothbard writes that little Rhode Island was actually unique. They all eventually were reopening. It just took some time, but right off the bat, it was Rhode Island was the most aggressive on this. He said there, all the courts remained open without interruption. In this colony, the backbones of the judges were fortified by the Assembly's pledge to indemnify all officials who ignored the Stamp Act, and all the courts continued happily to function. And this is because in September, the Rhode Island Assembly, they passed resolves against the Stamp Act, clearly influenced by Patrick Henry's resolves in Virginia. And here's a couple of pieces from this. His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance designed to impose any internal taxation whatsoever upon them, other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. You can see very clearly they're basically copying Patrick Henry's results. But that's why I'm saying this became a very popular mantra. They continued. All officers in this colony appointed by the authority thereof be and they are hereby directed to proceed in the execution of their respective offices in the same manner as usual. And this assembly will indemnify and save harmless all the said officers on account of their conduct agreeable to this resolution. So you have the courts getting more courage. Of course, people pressuring these offloaders, the ships, to not offload the stamps. Then the courts have a legal situation, and then you have a resolution that backs up the courts, gives them the courage to say, well, we're going to just go on with things as normal. And so that kind of made a very, very kind of comprehensive strategy, a blueprint to defeat their usurpation of power. Now, back to Rothbard. Newspapers were also under serious threat. He points out that for the work of nullifying the Stamp Act, ordinary business transactions within the colonies presented no problems. Contracts and exchanges could be made with the simple refusal of bothering about the Stamp Act's existence, and a lot of people did that. The major problem in domestic business was faced by the newspapers, who were in an exposed position. If you publish this thing and you don't have the stamp affixed to it, well, they're going to come and shut you down. Probably, at least that was a threat. And as November approached, he said the press reluctantly prepared to close up shop in obedience to the stamp law. And I think in many situations, it was really just fear. Here from the Journal of the American Revolution, which is allthingsliberty.com, they point out that one of the most famous and recognizable 18th century newspapers is the October 31st, 1765 issue of the Pennsylvania Journal, also known as the Tombstone edition. I think any of you who have read any history or looked through this stuff, or even just kind of casually perused, you'll probably recognize this when I pull it up here in a moment. They write, with the hated Stamp Act set to take an effect in the British North American colonies on November 1st, Philadelphia printer William Bradford designed this issue to resemble a tombstone, symbolizing the death of his newspaper. And here it is up here on the screen. He basically said, like, look, things might go dark here at the Journal and Weekly Advertiser for a bit, but it turns out that due to pressure from the people, support from the population, he actually never stopped printing. So on October 31st, the edition there looked like a tombstone, we're being killed. And then the next week, well, he kept publishing. And back to the Journal of American Revolution, Bradford never stopped printing his newspaper during the Stamp Act and continued business as usual with the November 7th edition the very next week. Facing threats of violence and property destruction, the appointed stamp distributor, John Hughes, promised not to execute the Stamp Act. That dude was really pressured aggressively to not enforce this thing. Now, back to Rothbard, he said the pattern of press courage was really set on November 1st, even before it happened in Philadelphia, with the bold appearance of the New London Gazette and the Connecticut Gazette without stamps. So here it is, a complete defiance. Even with the risk of losing their business, they're like, we're just going to do what we believe is correct. Freedom of the press is essential. The great radical organs of liberty, he says, the Boston Gazette, which is really the publication for the Sons of Liberty over the years, and the New York Gazette or Weekly Post Boy swiftly followed suit. You get one doing another, and of course, this thing goes like a domino effect. Rothbard points out that John Holt, editor of the New York paper, emblazoned on his newspaper the motto, liberty, property, and no stamps. I really dug around a lot to look for an image that I could share of this. I'm sure it's on microfiche somewhere, but I was not able to get a copy of that. But I know you're probably familiar with this. We know that this was used all over the place. They published articles and pamphlets in North Carolina. There was protests in Boston and New York and elsewhere, and this was a very popular slogan. According to Rothbard, this seems to be the beginning of that slogan: liberty, property, and no stamps. Maybe it came earlier. He said, well, this was soon picked up by other leading papers. Other northern newspapers continued to publish, first hedging with such partial disguises as changing their titles or leaving out the printers' names, but they soon resumed publication full blast. So, look, this is really going forward full steam. Now, I'm going to link to all this stuff, these original source documents, plus the article from Rothbard. I've got some articles from Journal of American Revolution, Mike Meharry, and others. A couple of episodes. That'll all be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We publish a blog post for every episode. Alan Mosley really does a great job getting that organized in a timely fashion where you can see all the different platforms we're on, all the video platforms where we live stream or archive, plus the audio-only podcast edition. And every episode, every blog post has a show link section, kind of in the order as I go through it in each episode. That way, because I'm just really scratching the surface, you can read more of this content, read through all of these source documents in context on your own time. And I'll get that published a couple of hours after this live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Anyways, let's get back to it. Back to Rothbard. He points out that internal transactions and then even the press successfully defied the stamp law. If the people resist it, when enough people say no, then it's harder and harder for them to enforce it. But there were still some problems. And Rothbard says the real problem for the colonists was transactions necessarily involving government agencies, which could not easily sanction the continuance of illegal activities. Now, we saw how the courts did in a number of colonies, and especially there in Maryland. And so they were sanctioning the courts. The local courts were defying Parliament, the far-off centralized power center, and just saying, this is what we're going to do. So it gave people kind of the legal backbone to be able to stand up even further. And Rothbard says the most vital question on this was foreign trade, on which many economic activities, especially in the port towns, depended absolutely. But for merchants, this is because merchants needed clearances from the royal customs officials to ship out of port. And without such clearance, they were liable to seizure. So they couldn't do anything. John Hancock very famously said, hey, don't ship me any more goods. Even though he could have continued doing business and getting richer and richer than he already was, he told his people in London, like, nah, not until this is gone. If you have to send stuff to me with these stamps on it, I'm not going to purchase anything. So you might as well just stop. And then, of course, that really kind of encouraged him to take further actions because people were really, really happy about that. Without clearance, they were liable to seizure, and they did by the British Navy, Rothbard writes, which did not have to worry about colonial opposition or rebellious activity on the Atlantic. So either direction, shipping stuff out for trade or bringing materials in was all requiring stamp clearances. But there was a response to this as well. And Rothbard says on the crucial question of foreign trade, which could make or break the resistance movement, the colonists could either greatly increase their smuggling operations, Hancock and others, of course, or put pressure on the royal customs officials to grant the merchants clearance papers. Both methods, he writes, were widely used. Now, if you want to get into the weeds, into the detail of how that all played out, you definitely want to read Rothbard. And again, this chapter will be linked to in the show notes. And of course, if you want to read more of his Conceived in Liberty, which is now a 5-volume set, with the most recent one published just a few years ago after his passing, it's really, really awesome stuff. So now, of course, the Sons of Liberty did put immense pressure on people like Andrew Oliver, because we're talking about how both smuggling and pressure on royal customs officials to grant the clearance papers, both of these tools were used. And of course, there was the Daughters of Liberty, who basically said they organized in late 1765 and early 1766, basically saying, well, we're going to boycott. We're going to stop using these various things. This is an important piece of this as well. Now, the Sons of Liberty did in Boston put immense pressure on people like Andrew Oliver, who, even though he did this kind of public resignation back on August 17th, he hadn't even gotten his official appointment yet until November 30th. So he resigned, and they were thinking, well, because he wasn't officially appointed yet until after the fact, we don't know if this holds validity. So On December 16th, Oliver was delivered a letter, and we actually have kind of the notes of all of this from Andrew Oliver himself. And on December 17th, he described what went down. He was expected to, he saw that a newspaper was expected to print the following. All the distributors and inspectors of the stamps throughout North America have in the most public and solemn, and some of them in a genteel and generous manner, resigned their detestable employment. People who were going to have jobs that involved enforcing acts that violated the unwritten British Constitution, the tradition of local self-government, the right to local self-government that violated liberty. These people were seen as having detestable employment, not honorable. Working for the government is not necessarily a good thing. And then they said this is what was going to be published, except only the Honorable Andrew Oliver, Esquire, Secretary of the Province of Massachusetts Bay and stamp distributor within the same, who has since the first instant has taken up his commission. Whether he intends to act under it or not is uncertain. He only can resolve the question. So Oliver was a little concerned about this, and he points, and I'm not sure who he was sending this whole detail to. I guess I didn't pay attention to the end of this as I was reviewing it, but he basically wrote about this, and he said, I was concerned. The newspaper was concerned that they didn't publish this anonymous thing about me. Am I going to enforce this? They're going to have problems. And if I don't respond to it, I'm going to have problems. So he authorized this to be published. Having received the foregoing anonymous letter, we thought it prudent to acquaint Mr. Oliver with the contents. He frankly told us that although he had now received a deputation to act as distributor of the stamps for the provinces of the Massachusetts, he had taken no measures to qualify himself for the office, nor had he any thoughts of doing it, and gave us liberty to assure the public that he would not. Now, Oliver thought this was going to be good enough, but it was not. And on December 17th, very early in the morning, Tuesday morning, December 17th, 1765, a bunch of handbills went all over the place. I've got an image of one. This is a very famous one. The true-born sons of liberty are desired to meet under the Liberty Tree at 12 o'clock this day to hear the public resignation under oath of Andrew Oliver, distributor of stamps for the province of the Massachusetts Bay. So on December 17th, within hours of all this playing out, the Sons of Liberty organized 2,000 people to show up under that Liberty Tree for a public protest demanding that Andrew Oliver formally resign. And Oliver describes it like this. The gentleman persuaded them to accept of what I had offered, what they had published previously, and would have recommended to them to have taken it upon my word of honor. But the people insisted upon my swearing to it. I acquiesced, and then being accompanied by the said gentleman, repaired to the house to which the Tree of Liberty so-called belonged. There, where I imagine at least 2,000 people present, and would have been many more had it not been a very rainy day. So he read off what he promised to do and swore under oath that this is what he was going to do. He said, I do hereby, in the most explicit and unreserved manner, declare that I have never taken any measures in consequence of my deputation for that purpose to act in the office, and that I never will directly or indirectly by myself or under me or any under me make use of the said deputation or take any measures for enforcing the Stamp Act in America, which is so grievous to the people. Now, it wasn't just this type of public pressure that happened that really kind of made people fearful of being enforcers, but certainly there were other people that were already in office that took the right position as well. And Rothbard points out that the earliest and easiest resolution to this issue of foreign trade came in Virginia, which had the good fortune of having a liberal and understanding surveyor general in Peter Randolph of the eminent Virginia family. We know of others like Edmund Randolph, for example, the first attorney general. Rothbard points out that as early as November 2nd, the first day after it went into effect, Randolph advised all the custom collectors to clear all vessels without stamped paper. So you have local royal officials saying, we're also going to defy this as well. The governor of Virginia was also intelligent about the issue, said Rothbard, and quickly seconded Randolph's stand. We also have Pennsylvania. He said the merchants of Philadelphia used an ingenious device. So you have to have creative strategy as well of adding clearances to partially loaded cargo ships before November to extend their time of grace through that month. So if they already got stuff out, they at least kept the ball rolling so they can have some income and things like that. But Governor John Penn then induced the local collector to go along with the same scheme. And by early December, though, the Philadelphia harbor was filled with vessels, and the custom officials faced squarely the problem of clearances. So there's all these things that needed to be cleared. What's going to happen? Rothbard points out that writing to England, the Philadelphia collectors admitted their fear of the populace should they enforce the Stamp Act, and they soon began to issue ship clearances. Now, from there, it quickly spread all over the place, and ships were being cleared in various locations. For example, Charles Stewart, who was the surveyor general for a bunch of colonies, I think New York, New Jersey, all of Pennsylvania, Delaware, he authorized customs officials to issue ship clearances without stamps. So this is just being defied at basically every level. And in time, this also spread throughout the South. And I think only in Georgia. Georgia may have been the only place where a stamp collector was even able to distribute stamped paper, but he was quickly forced to flee very, very shortly after he started doing this. Now, I think tying this all together, the most important piece of the puzzle was the attitude that the people had about this. Some people were making the case like, oh, this is just kind of a small tax. It's a lot for us to kind of stick our neck out. We should just issue resolutions. We should issue petitions. We should ask them, point out how many problems it's going to cause for us. But even though much of that was done, they certainly had a much more fierce attitude about it. And John Hancock summed it up in October of 1765 in a letter that he sent to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard. He said, "The people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act." So Hancock summed up the mentality of the day, that the people would not submit. It doesn't matter if the tax was large or small. And the issue was that it set a precedent, because if you comply with one, they're certainly going to say, well, now this is part of our system, especially in a system based so much on precedent. We're not supposed to have a system based solely on precedent today, but in many situations we do. And that makes it so close to the unlimited power. Well, I mean, with technology, there's more power today, but the foundational principle that they had power in every situation. And when you build upon precedent, upon precedent, upon precedent, nothing ever goes away. And that's what John Dickinson put in his very, very widely, I think, influential broadside against the Stamp Act shortly after it went into effect in November. He was also the author of the resolutions of the Stamp Act Congress, which were much more mild. It was more of a petition. But here's how he put it, what he told the people to do. He said, if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. So compliance with an unconstitutional act, an act that violates your liberty, is setting the precedent for perpetual despotism. And that's what he said. You unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. So Dickinson's saying, like, if you oppose the idea of them having power to implement internal taxes, merely complying with it will ensure that they're going to do more and more and more. Government power is never all about like, what's the least we can do? They're always going to push for what the most they can get away with. And as long as people comply with it, they have no reason to give up power that they already have. And that's how Dickinson basically put it. The Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. And he summed it up with this. For these reasons, and many more, it appears to be the wisest and safest course for you to proceed in all business as usual, without taking the least notice of the Stamp Act. In other words, just conduct business as you always have. Ignore it. They won't be able to enforce it if enough of us say no, and that's the mentality that they used for sure. Now, this, of course, as I mentioned right at the beginning, this was carried forward by the founders to how they said, especially on the Federalist side, the framers of the Constitution, on how they said that the document that they were supporting was to be enforced. James Iredell, for example, in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention, he was one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court. He was nominated by George Washington, one of the top legal minds of the day. What did he say? The way to deal with usurpations of power is go to courts, go to people like me, and good guys on the court are going to strike down those acts. No. He said the only resource against usurpation, the only way to deal with usurpation, that is a theft of power, power exercised by government with no constitutional authority. The only resource against this is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. Not the inherent right of the people to ask the government to stop doing what the government was never supposed to do in the first place. No, he said the people will resist if government usurps power. Well, at least that's how they're supposed to deal with it. Here's Roger Sherman, December of 1787. Similar view. All acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. You could see how we go back to Patrick Henry in those Virginia resolves against the Stamp Act, where he said, this is crossing the line in the sand. This is illegal, immoral, unjust, unconstitutional. I forget exactly. He definitely said unconstitutional. So this is illegal. And well, you're not bound to obey them. And that's how you deal with it. Roger Sherman certainly understood this, having lived through that resistance as well. All acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. Sherman recognized that when government does stuff that government is not authorized to do, government will try to enforce it. But when enough people of the states say, no, we will not comply, then those acts are not just void in theory, they're void in practice. And even Alexander Hamilton got in on this in Federalist number 33. He was describing the supremacy clause and basically refuting claims that they were going to have power in all cases whatsoever. He's like, no. He said, acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. When you have an act of usurpation, this is them stealing power from the final authority of the people of the several states or of the people of the colonies during the American Revolution. When they're stealing power, you don't just say to a thief, hey, if you decide you want to keep what you've stolen, you can, but please stop. No. You resist it. You defy it in every way possible. Of course, it requires really good strategy. James Madison kind of summed it up, and you'll see some very close similarities to how he said we're supposed to respond to usurpations of power by the federal government under the Constitution or bad policy. He said you could use this for either situation, whether they go beyond their limits or if they're doing stuff that you just want to get rid of that they refuse to do so. It was a combination of mass protest. This is from Federalist number 46. I've done episodes covering this because it takes a lot to cover, but just briefly, he said you have to have mass protests by the people. Their repugnance, he said. You need outspoken governors. Legislative devices are added. We can see how during the Stamp Act, they certainly used various resolutions to help encourage more action. And most importantly, on a state, local, and individual level, Madison said, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And during the height of the American Revolution, I think Samuel Adams may have summed it up best. The truth is, he said, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. Now, if you're like me, you notice that government-run schools never, ever teach us this stuff. They want us to believe that the only way to deal with what we think are usurpations of power is to ask government to agree with us, is to basically ask government to stop doing what government was never supposed to do in the first place. And on top of it, government only stops if government determines that government violated the Constitution. This flips the entire system upside down. And that's why we work so hard every single day to reach and teach people more and more every single day about these essential foundational principles about the Constitution and going back to the American Revolution, how to advance liberty When government refuses to do its job and stay within the bounds of the Constitution, which for us is 24/7, 365, and nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And if you want to do just a one-time contribution, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I really appreciate you being here. If you want to help us spread the word in some free and easy peasy ways, you can hit the like button, leave reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, sharing links, all these things on these, especially the mainstream platforms, can trigger their algorithms and tell them to show us to more people. We're reaching more people than I ever thought possible, but we're still scratching the surface. Now I've got a new standard of where we need to go, and I'm very grateful for your help in getting us there in the near future. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is where you can support us. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where the blog post for this episode will be published in a couple of hours. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.